Captain Richard Carmichael gripped the control yoke of his B-17C Flying Fortress as the first wave of Japanese fighters screamed past his aircraft, their wings flashing with the red circles of the rising sun. He had been approaching Hickam Field for a routine landing after a 14-hour flight from California, when the peaceful morning had exploded into chaos. Below him, Pearl Harbor was burning, massive columns of black smoke rising from the shattered battleships. Around him, the sky was filled with Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, swarming like angry hornets. Carmichael's bomber was unarmed, its guns removed to save weight for the long trans-Pacific flight, and he was carrying a crew of exhausted men who had expected to land and rest, not fight for their lives against an enemy they hadn't known existed an hour ago. Friends, like and subscribe to the channel, and we will continue. A Zero pulled up alongside the B-17, close enough that Carmichael could see the pilot's face through the canopy. The Japanese pilot was young, perhaps 22 or 23, and his expression was one of contempt mixed with curiosity as he examined the large American bomber. The Zero waggled its wings, almost playfully, then peeled away and came around for an attack run. Carmichael watched in his mirror as the fighter lined up behind him, saw the muzzle flashes as the Zero's guns opened fire. Bullets stitched across the B-17's fuselage, punching holes in the aluminum skin, but the bomber flew on, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines roaring steadily. The Zero made another pass, and another, each time raking the flying fortress with machine gun and cannon fire. Carmichael felt the aircraft shudder with each impact, heard his crew shouting damage reports over the intercom. But somehow, the B-17 stayed in the air, its massive wings and redundant systems absorbing punishment that would have destroyed a smaller aircraft. The Japanese pilot must have been puzzled by the bomber's refusal to fall. He had hit it dozens of times, had seen his bullets tear through its fuselage and wings, yet the B-17 continued flying as if nothing had happened. The Zero made one more pass, expending the last of its ammunition, then broke away and headed back toward its carrier. Carmichael watched it go, then looked around his aircraft. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from damaged lines. One engine was running rough, and his tail gunner had been wounded by shrapnel. But the B-17 was still flying, still controllable, still capable of landing. Carmichael brought the bomber down at Hickam Field, threading between burning buildings and cratered runways, and set it down hard on a strip of undamaged concrete. As the crew evacuated the aircraft, they counted over 70 bullet holes in the fuselage and wings. The B-17 had taken a beating that should have killed it, but it had brought them home. It was the first demonstration of what would become the Flying Fortress's legendary reputation for survivability. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots encountered the B-17 again and again as American forces struggled to defend the Philippines, Java, and other Pacific outposts. The Japanese had dominated the skies over China and Southeast Asia with their nimble Zero fighters, shooting down slower Allied aircraft with contemptuous ease. When they first saw the B-17, they were unimpressed. The bomber was large and ungainly, slow compared to fighters, and seemed to lack the maneuverability needed to survive in combat. Japanese pilots nicknamed it the flying dump truck, a derisive term that reflected their belief that the B-17 was an easy target, a lumbering giant that would fall quickly to their superior fighters. They approached their first engagements with B-17s expecting quick victories, anticipating that the American bombers would go down in flames, just like the British and Dutch aircraft they had been destroying for months. What they discovered instead would shock them and force a fundamental reassessment of American air power. The B-17 was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered before. It was designed from the beginning as a strategic bomber capable of defending itself against fighter attack. Its designers at Boeing had given it heavy armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when hit, and most importantly, a defensive armament that turned the bomber into a flying fortress, in truth as well as name. The B-17E model, which began reaching the Pacific in early 1942, carried 13 .50-caliber machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, covering every approach angle. A Japanese pilot attacking a B-17 would face defensive fire from multiple gun positions simultaneously, creating a lethal crossfire that made close-range attacks extremely dangerous. The bomber's crew had trained extensively in defensive tactics, learning to coordinate their fire and support each other, turning the B-17 into a cooperative weapons system rather than just a collection of individual guns. But the B-17's most important defensive feature wasn't its guns. It was its ability to absorb damage and keep flying. The bomber's designers had incorporated multiple redundant systems so that damage to one component wouldn't disable the entire aircraft. The 4 engines were mounted far apart on the wings so that losing 1 or even 2 engines wouldn't necessarily bring the bomber down. The control cables were duplicated and routed through different parts of the aircraft so that a single hit couldn't sever all control authority. The fuel tanks were protected by layers of rubber that would seal around bullet holes, preventing leaks and fires. The crew positions were armored, protecting the men from shrapnel and small-caliber bullets. Every aspect of the B-17's design reflected a philosophy that accepted the reality of combat damage and sought to ensure the aircraft could survive it and return home. This philosophy was completely foreign to Japanese aircraft design, which emphasized speed and maneuverability over protection, accepting vulnerability as the price of performance. The first major air battle that demonstrated the B-17's capabilities occurred on January 10, 1942, over the Philippines. A formation of 9 B-17s from the 19th Bomb Group was attacking Japanese shipping in the Lingayen Gulf when they were intercepted by over 30 Zero fighters. The Japanese pilots, confident in their superior numbers and the proven effectiveness of their tactics, attacked aggressively, expecting to shoot down the American bombers quickly. What followed was a brutal 40-minute battle that shattered Japanese assumptions about American air power. The B-17s maintained tight formation, their overlapping defensive fire creating zones of death that the Zeros had to penetrate to make effective attacks. Japanese pilots who pressed their attacks found themselves flying through streams of .50-caliber bullets that tore through their lightly armored aircraft. Several Zeros were shot down in the initial attacks, their pilots shocked by the intensity of the defensive fire. The Japanese adjusted their tactics, trying to attack from angles where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest, but they discovered that the bomber had no blind spots. Attacks from below were met by the ball turret gunner, a man suspended in a rotating glass sphere beneath the fuselage with twin .50-caliber guns. Attacks from above faced fire from the top turret, another rotating position with excellent visibility and fields of fire. Head-on attacks which the Japanese had used successfully against other bombers, were met by guns in the nose and by the simple fact that closing speeds were so high that the Zero pilots had only seconds to aim and fire before having to break away to avoid collision. Tail attacks, traditionally the safest approach to a bomber, were the most dangerous of all, as the tail gunner had a clear field of fire and could engage attackers at long range. The Zeros made repeated attacks, hitting the B-17s again and again, but the bombers refused to fall. Their armor absorbed the punishment, their self-sealing tanks prevented fires, and their redundant systems kept them flying even with significant damage. After 40 minutes of combat, the Japanese fighters broke off the attack, low on fuel and ammunition. They had shot down one B-17 and damaged several others, but 8 bombers had survived and were heading back to base. The Japanese pilots were stunned. They had expended enormous amounts of ammunition, had made dozens of attack runs, had hit the American bombers repeatedly, and had achieved almost nothing. The B-17s had completed their bombing run, had fought off a force more than 3 times their number, and had mostly survived. The flying dump trucks had proven to be far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As word of the battle spread through Japanese fighter units, the mockery and contempt began to be replaced by respect and caution. The Americans had brought a new kind of bomber to the Pacific, one that could fight back and survive, and defeating it would require new tactics and new weapons. The age of the flying fortress had begun, and it would change the nature of aerial warfare in ways that neither side fully understood yet. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's most skilled fighter pilots, a veteran of the China campaign with 11 confirmed kills to his credit. He had flown the Mitsubishi A6M0 since the beginning of the war, and he considered it the finest fighter aircraft in the world. The Zero could outmaneuver any Allied fighter, could climb faster, could turn tighter, and in the hands of an experienced pilot like Sakai, it was a lethal weapon that dominated the skies. On this morning, Sakai and his squadron had been scrambled to intercept a formation of American B-17s that were attacking Japanese shipping near Java. As he climbed toward the bomber formation, Sakai felt the familiar confidence that came from knowing he was flying a superior aircraft against an inferior enemy. He had shot down Chinese bombers, British Blenheims, and Dutch aircraft with ease. The American B-17s would be no different, or so he thought. As Sakai approached the B-17 formation, he studied them carefully, analyzing their defensive capabilities and looking for weaknesses to exploit. There were 6 bombers flying in a tight box formation, each aircraft positioned to provide supporting fire to its neighbors. Sakai had encountered this tactic before with other bombers, and he knew that the key was to break up the formation, to isolate individual aircraft, and then destroy them one by one. He signaled his wingmen and began his attack approach, coming in from the side and slightly above, an angle that had worked well against other bombers. But as he closed to firing range, something unexpected happened. The B-17s didn't waver or break formation. Instead, their gun turrets swiveled toward him, and suddenly the air around his Zero was filled with tracer rounds, bright streams of .50 caliber bullets that seemed to come from every direction at once. Sakai broke off his attack, shocked by the intensity of the defensive fire. He had never encountered anything like it. The B-17s were firing from multiple positions simultaneously, creating an interlocking pattern of fire that made it almost impossible to approach safely. He circled around and tried a different angle, this time attacking from below. But the ball turret gunner spotted him immediately and opened fire. Bullets cracked past Sakai's canopy, close enough that he could hear them over the roar of his engine. He pulled up sharply, his Zero responding instantly to the controls, and climbed away from the formation. Around him, other Japanese pilots were making their own attacks, and Sakai could see several Zeros breaking away with damage, trailing smoke or glycol coolant. One Zero had been hit badly and was spiraling down toward the sea, its pilot slumped in the cockpit. The Americans were fighting back with a ferocity and effectiveness that Sakai had not anticipated. The Japanese pilots regrouped and tried coordinated attacks, with multiple fighters hitting the formation from different angles simultaneously to divide the defensive fire. This tactic worked better, and Sakai managed to get close enough to pour cannon fire into one of the B-17s. He saw his 20mm shells explode along the bomber's fuselage, saw pieces of metal tear away, saw smoke begin to stream from one of the engines. But the B-17 didn't fall. It didn't even leave formation. The damaged engine was feathered, its propeller stopped to reduce drag, and the bomber continued flying on 3 engines as if nothing had happened. Sakai made another pass, hitting the same aircraft again, and this time he saw flames erupt from the damaged engine. Surely now the bomber would go down. But instead the crew activated the engine's fire suppression system, and the flames were extinguished within seconds. The B-17 flew on, damaged but still dangerous, its guns still firing at any Zero that came within range. Sakai had been in combat for over 30 minutes now, and his ammunition was running low. He had hit the B-17 multiple times with both machine gun and cannon fire, had scored what should have been killing hits, but the bomber was still flying. Around him, the rest of his squadron was having similar experiences. They had damaged several B-17s, had shot away pieces of wings and fuselages, had knocked out engines and shattered gun positions, but they had only managed to shoot down one bomber, and that had required concentrated fire from 4 different Zeros attacking simultaneously. The cost had been high, 3 Zeros shot down, and 2 more so badly damaged that they would never fly again. It was an exchange rate that shocked Sakai. In previous battles, his squadron had routinely shot down 5 or 6 enemy aircraft without losing a single Zero. But the B-17s were different. They were tough, resilient, and deadly, and they refused to die easily. As the B-17 formation turned for home, still maintaining their tight defensive box despite the damage they had sustained, Sakai followed at a distance, studying them and trying to understand what made them so difficult to destroy. He realized that the Americans had designed their bomber with a completely different philosophy than Japanese aircraft. Where Japanese designers prioritized performance and accepted vulnerability, American designers had prioritized survivability and accepted reduced performance. The B-17 was slower than a Zero, less maneuverable, less elegant in its design, but it was also far more rugged, far better protected, and far more capable of absorbing battle damage. It was a philosophy that reflected different cultural values and different strategic priorities. Japan needed to achieve quick victories with limited resources, so they built aircraft that were lethal but fragile. America had vast industrial capacity and could afford to build aircraft that were heavy and expensive, but that brought their crews home alive. Sakai returned to base and filed his combat report, describing the B-17's defensive capabilities in detail and recommending new tactics for attacking them. He suggested that Japanese fighters should attack from directly ahead or directly behind, where the defensive fire was somewhat less intense, and that attacks should be made in coordinated waves to overwhelm the gunners. He also recommended that pilots should aim for specific, vulnerable points: the cockpit, the bomb bay, the wing routes where the fuel tanks were located, rather than simply shooting at the largest part of the aircraft. Most importantly, he warned that the B-17 should not be underestimated or mocked. It was a formidable opponent that demanded respect and careful tactics. The flying dump truck nickname was abandoned after Sakai's report circulated through Japanese fighter units. In its place came a new term: the four-engine fighter, a recognition that the B-17 was as dangerous to Japanese aircraft as they were to it. Over the following weeks, Japanese pilots developed new tactics specifically designed to counter the B-17's advantages. They began making high-speed diving attacks from above, using gravity to increase their closing speed and reduce the time they were exposed to defensive fire. They experimented with air-to-air bombing, dropping phosphorus bombs into bomber formations from above, though this proved largely ineffective. Some pilots tried ramming attacks, deliberately colliding with B-17s to destroy them, a tactic that reflected the growing desperation of Japanese commanders as they realized that conventional attacks were too costly. The most effective tactic proved to be the head-on attack, where Zeros would approach the B-17 formation from directly ahead, fire their weapons during the brief moment when they were in range, and then break away by diving beneath the bombers. This tactic exploited the B-17's relatively weak forward armament and made it difficult for the defensive gunners to track and engage the attacking fighters. But even these improved tactics came at a cost. Head-on attacks required exceptional skill and nerve, as the closing speed between a Zero and a B-17 was over 500 miles per hour, giving the pilot less than 2 seconds to aim and fire before having to break away. Misjudge the distance by even a fraction of a second, and the Zero would collide with the bomber, killing both crews. Many Japanese pilots died learning this tactic, and even successful attacks often resulted in only minor damage to the B-17s. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning from each engagement and improving their own tactics. B-17 formations began flying tighter, reducing the gaps that Japanese fighters could exploit. Gunners trained to coordinate their fire more effectively, creating even denser defensive barrages. And most importantly, the B-17E model began to be replaced by the B-17F and later the B-17G, each version incorporating lessons learned from combat and adding more armor, more guns, and better defensive systems. By mid-1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted. The Japanese advance had been stopped at Midway and Guadalcanal, and American industrial production was beginning to overwhelm Japanese capacity. B-17s were being produced at a rate of over 300 per month, while Japanese aircraft production struggled to replace losses. Every B-17 that Japanese fighters shot down was quickly replaced by 2 or 3 more, while every Zero lost represented a growing gap in Japanese defensive capabilities. The exchange rates that had seemed acceptable early in the war, trading 1 Zero for 1 B-17, became unsustainable as American numbers grew and Japanese numbers shrank. Lieutenant Sakai, who survived the war as Japan's third highest-scoring ace, would later write in his memoirs that the B-17 was one of the most formidable aircraft he had ever faced, a bomber that had earned his respect through its toughness and the skill of its crews. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had once mocked as a flying dump truck had proven to be a war-winning weapon that helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Captain James "Jimmy" Dolan sat in the pilot's seat of his B-17E, leading a formation of 8 flying fortresses toward the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. Below him, the volcanic peaks of New Britain rose through scattered clouds, and ahead he could see the harbor where Japanese ships clustered like toys in a bathtub. This was the deepest penetration into Japanese-held territory that American bombers had attempted, and Dolan knew that the enemy would throw everything they had at his formation. His crew was tense but ready, each man at his position, scanning the sky for the fighters that would inevitably come. Dolan had flown 12 combat missions already, and he had learned that survival depended on 3 things: maintaining tight formation, coordinating defensive fire, and never ever panicking when the Zeros attacked. The Japanese fighters appeared suddenly, climbing up from below like sharks rising from deep water. Dolan counted at least 20 Zeros, possibly more, and he knew this would be the toughest fight his crew had faced. "Fighters coming up, 11 o'clock low," called his bombardier over the intercom. "Gunners, watch your sectors and don't waste ammunition. Fire in short bursts and make every round count." The Zeros split into 2 groups, one attacking from the front and one sweeping around to hit from the side. It was a coordinated tactic, designed to divide the defensive fire and create openings for killing shots. But Dolan's formation was ready. The 8 B-17s flew so close together that their wingtips were almost touching, creating an overlapping field of fire that covered every approach angle. The first Zero came in fast, its nose lighting up with muzzle flashes as the pilot opened fire. Dolan's top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike Kowalski, tracked the fighter and fired a long burst from his twin .50 calibers. The tracer rounds walked across the sky toward the Zero, and suddenly the Japanese fighter exploded in a ball of flame, its fuel tanks ignited by the heavy bullets. "Got him!" Kowalski shouted, his voice cracking with excitement and adrenaline. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 more Zeros were coming in from the right, and the waist gunners were firing desperately, their guns hammering so fast that the spent shell casings piled up on the floor of the fuselage. 1 Zero broke away trailing smoke, but the other pressed its attack, cannon shells walking across the B-17's right wing. Dolan felt the aircraft shudder as the shells exploded, but the wing held, the structural spars absorbing the damage. More Zeros swarmed around the B-17 formation like angry wasps, their pilots growing increasingly frustrated as bomber after bomber refused to fall despite repeated hits. Dolan's aircraft had been struck dozens of times now, holes punched through the fuselage and wings, but the flying fortress lived up to its name, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft. In the ball turret beneath the fuselage, Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez was fighting his own private war, rotating his glass sphere to track fighters attacking from below. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on the aircraft, a transparent bubble that offered no protection except the gunner's skill and the hope that enemy bullets would miss. Rodriguez had already shot down 1 Zero and damaged another, but now a third was lining up for an attack run directly beneath the formation. Rodriguez waited until the Zero was at point-blank range, less than 200 yards away, then squeezed his triggers. The twin .50 calibers roared, and he watched his tracer rounds converge on the Japanese fighter. The Zero's canopy shattered, and the aircraft rolled over and fell away, trailing smoke and debris. "Scratch another one," Rodriguez called over the intercom, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. But his victory was short-lived. A 20mm cannon shell from another Zero struck the ball turret's support structure, and Rodriguez felt the entire turret shudder violently. Hydraulic fluid began spraying into the cramped space, and the turret's rotation mechanism jammed, leaving him stuck facing backward, unable to engage targets ahead of the aircraft. He was trapped in a glass bubble, unable to move, unable to escape, completely vulnerable to any fighter that attacked from his blind spot. In the cockpit, Dolan was fighting to keep the formation together, as the Zeros pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, was calling out damage reports as they came in over the intercom. "Number 3 engine losing oil pressure, right waist gun jammed, ball turret hydraulics out. Tail gunner reports 2 fighters coming in from 6 o'clock high." Dolan acknowledged each report with a grunt, his hands steady on the control yoke despite the chaos. He had learned early in his combat career that panic was more deadly than enemy fire. A pilot who kept his head, who flew his aircraft smoothly and maintained formation discipline, had a far better chance of survival than one who broke formation and tried to run. The B-17 was tough, but it wasn't invincible. Alone and isolated, it could be overwhelmed by determined fighter attacks. But in formation, with overlapping fields of fire and mutual support, the flying fortresses were nearly unstoppable. The tail gunner, Sergeant Bill "Tex" Harrison, was facing the most intense part of the battle. 2 Zeros were making coordinated attacks from directly behind, one high and one low, trying to split his attention and create an opening. Harrison was a veteran gunner who had survived 15 missions, and he knew that the key to survival was to stay calm and pick his targets carefully. He ignored the low Zero and focused on the high one, which was closer and more dangerous. He fired a short burst, adjusted his aim as the tracer rounds fell short, then fired again. This time his bullets found their mark, stitching across the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter's propeller flew apart, and the aircraft nosed over and began falling toward the ocean far below. But the second Zero was still coming, and Harrison swung his gun down to engage it. He was too slow. The Zero's pilot fired a long burst, and 7.7mm bullets raked across the tail section of the B-17, several rounds punching through the thin aluminum skin and ricocheting around the cramped tail gunner's position. Harrison felt a hammer blow to his left shoulder and knew he had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit, hot and sticky, and his left arm went numb. But he kept his right hand on the gun controls and continued firing, ignoring the pain and the spreading wetness. The Zero broke away, apparently satisfied that it had neutralized the tail gun, and Harrison slumped against his gun mount, breathing hard. "Tail gunner hit," he called over the intercom, his voice tight with pain. "Can still shoot, but need help back here." The radio operator, Sergeant Dave Chen, immediately left his position and crawled back through the narrow fuselage to the tail, carrying the first aid kit. He found Harrison pale and bleeding but still conscious, still gripping his gun controls with his good hand. Chen quickly applied a pressure bandage to the wound, gave Harrison a shot of morphine, and helped him get back on his gun. "You're going to be fine, Tex," Chen said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Just hang on until we get home." The bomb run was approaching now, and Dolan had to fly straight and level despite the continuing fighter attacks, giving his bombardier time to line up on the target. It was the most vulnerable moment of any bombing mission, the point where evasive maneuvers were impossible, and the aircraft became a steady platform for enemy gunners. Below, Japanese anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. The B-17 shuddered as flak fragments peppered its underside, adding to the damage already inflicted by the fighters. "Bomb bay doors open," called the bombardier. "Steady, steady, bombs away." The B-17 lurched upward as 4 tons of high-explosive bombs fell away, tumbling down toward the ships in Rabaul Harbor. Dolan immediately threw the aircraft into a hard turn, breaking away from the target area and heading for home. Behind him, the other B-17s in the formation were also turning, their bomb bays empty, their crews exhausted but alive. The Zeros made a few more half-hearted attacks, but they were low on fuel and ammunition, and they soon broke off and headed back to their base. Dolan assessed his aircraft's condition as the formation limped away from Rabaul. Number 3 engine was completely dead, its propeller feathered and motionless. Number 4 was running rough, temperature gauges climbing into the red zone. The right wing had at least 50 holes in it, some large enough to stick a fist through. The hydraulic system was barely functional, which meant landing gear deployment would be problematic. Fuel was leaking from punctured tanks, leaving a thin vapor trail behind the aircraft. And Tex Harrison in the tail was wounded, possibly seriously despite Chen's first aid. By any reasonable assessment, the B-17 should have gone down over Rabaul. But it was still flying, still controlating, still bringing its crew home. This was the miracle of the flying fortress, its ability to absorb catastrophic damage and continue functioning. "How's everyone doing?" Dolan called over the intercom, checking in with each crew position. The responses came back one by one. Tired, scared, some wounded, but alive and functional. Rodriguez was still stuck in the jammed ball turret, cramped and uncomfortable, but uninjured. Kowalski in the top turret had taken shrapnel in his leg, but insisted he could still man his guns if more fighters appeared. The waist gunners reported their position was a mess of spent shell casings, hydraulic fluid, and blood. But both guns were still operational. Morrison, the co-pilot, had a cut on his forehead from flying glass, but was otherwise fine. They had been incredibly lucky. Dolan had heard stories of B-17s that had lost half their crew to fighter attacks, that had limped home with dead and dying men scattered throughout the fuselage. His crew had survived relatively intact, a testament to the aircraft's protective armor and the skill of his gunners. The formation was breaking up now as damaged aircraft fell behind, unable to maintain the pace. Dolan's B-17 was one of the slower ones, struggling along on 2.5 engines while the less damaged bombers pulled ahead. This was dangerous. Isolated aircraft were vulnerable to attack, but there was no choice. The damaged bombers simply couldn't keep up. Dolan watched as 2 B-17s ahead of him began descending, trailing smoke, heading for emergency landing fields in New Guinea. Another bomber, its entire nose section shot away, was somehow still flying, the bombardier and navigator dead, but the pilots still at the controls. The resilience of the B-17 was almost unbelievable. Aircraft that looked like they should fall apart were holding together through sheer structural integrity and the determination of their crews. 2 hours later, Dolan's base came into view, a rough airstrip carved out of the jungle with tents and crude buildings scattered around the perimeter. He circled once, firing a red flare to indicate wounded aboard. then lined up for landing. The hydraulic system had failed completely now, which meant the landing gear had to be cranked down manually, an exhausting process that required Morrison and the flight engineer to work a hand crank for 15 minutes. The gear finally locked into place, but Dolan had no way to verify that all 3 wheels were down and locked. He would have to trust that the mechanical indicators were accurate and hope that the gear wouldn't collapse on touchdown. The flaps were also inoperative, which meant the landing speed would be higher than normal and the landing roll longer. Dolan hoped the runway was long enough. The B-17 came in fast and hard, touching down with a jarring impact that sent shudders through the damaged airframe. Dolan stood on the brakes, feeling them grab unevenly as damaged hydraulic lines struggled to provide pressure. The bomber rolled down the runway, slowing gradually, finally coming to a stop just 50 feet from the end of the strip. Dolan shut down the remaining engines and sat for a moment in silence, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. They had made it. Against all odds, through fighter attacks and flak and mechanical failures, they had completed their mission and brought the aircraft home. Around him, the crew was stirring, unbuckling harnesses, preparing to evacuate. Medical personnel were already running toward the aircraft to help Tex Harrison and the other wounded men. Dolan climbed down from the cockpit and walked around his B-17, examining the damage in the harsh sunlight. The aircraft looked like it had been through a shredder. Hundreds of bullet holes, dozens of cannon shell impacts, entire sections of skin peeled away or missing. The right wing was so damaged that Dolan could see completely through it in places, the internal structure exposed like bones beneath torn flesh. The tail section was barely attached, held on by a few structural members that had somehow survived the Zero's attack. One engine was completely destroyed, another would need to be replaced, and the fuselage would require extensive repairs before the aircraft could fly again. But it had brought them home. That was what mattered. The ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named O'Brien, walked up beside Dolan and whistled low. "Jesus, Captain, I've seen some shot-up birds, but this one takes the cake. How the hell did you keep it in the air?" Dolan shook his head, still trying to process what they had been through. "The airplane did it, Chief. We just steered. I've never seen anything like it. We took hits that should have killed us 10 times over. But the Fortress just kept flying." O'Brien nodded, running his hand along the damaged fuselage. "That's why they call it the Flying Fortress, sir. Boeing built one hell of an airplane. The Japs can mock it all they want, call it a dump truck or whatever. But at the end of the day, this bird brings its crew home, and that's worth more than speed or maneuverability or anything else." Dolan had to agree. He had flown fighters before the war, had loved the thrill of aerobatics, and the feeling of a responsive, nimble aircraft. But he had never felt safer than he did in the B-17, surrounded by armor and redundant systems, and the knowledge that the aircraft would absorb punishment and protect its crew. The intelligence officer arrived to debrief the crew, and Dolan gave his report. 8 B-17s had attacked Rabaul. All 8 had returned, though 2 had made emergency landings and would need extensive repairs. They had destroyed or damaged at least 12 Japanese ships in the harbor and had shot down 7 confirmed Zeros with 3 more probables. The cost had been 3 men wounded, none seriously, and significant damage to 5 aircraft. By any measure, it was a successful mission. But more importantly, it was another demonstration of the B-17's capabilities, another data point in the growing body of evidence that the Flying Fortress was changing the nature of aerial warfare. The Japanese had learned to respect the B-17, had stopped mocking it, and started fearing it. And as American production ramped up and more fortresses arrived in the Pacific, that fear would only grow. Commander Minoru Genda sat in the operations room studying combat reports from the past 3 months, and the picture they painted was deeply troubling. Japanese fighter pilots were shooting down B-17s, but the exchange ratio was completely unacceptable. For every flying fortress destroyed, the Imperial Japanese Navy was losing an average of 2.30 fighters and their pilots. Worse, the B-17s were achieving their mission objectives more than 70% of the time, inflicting significant damage on Japanese shipping, airfields, and installations despite the intense fighter opposition. Genda was one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds, the man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, and he understood immediately that this situation was unsustainable. Japan could not afford to trade experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft for American bombers that were being produced by the hundreds every month. The problem, Genda realized, was not simply the B-17's toughness or defensive armament, though both were formidable. The deeper issue was that American and Japanese air doctrines reflected fundamentally different strategic realities. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained pilots and limited capacity to train replacements. Every pilot lost was a significant blow to Japanese combat capability. The United States, by contrast, had established massive pilot training programs that were producing thousands of new aviators every month. America could afford to lose pilots and aircraft because they would be quickly replaced. Japan could not. This asymmetry meant that even favorable exchange ratios, 2 B-17s for 3 zeros, ultimately favored the Americans because they could sustain losses that would cripple Japanese air power. Genda began developing new tactical doctrines specifically designed to counter the B-17 threat while minimizing Japanese losses. He ordered that fighter attacks should be concentrated on isolated bombers rather than tight formations, that pilots should break off attacks if defensive fire became too intense, and that damaged B-17s should be tracked and attacked during their return flight when they were most vulnerable. He also recommended the development of specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft equipped with heavier armament, 37mm or even 40mm cannons, that could destroy B-17s with a single, well-placed hit. These tactics showed some improvement, but the fundamental problem remained. The B-17 was simply too tough to be efficiently destroyed by existing Japanese fighters using existing tactics. Meanwhile, American crews were also learning and adapting. Combat experience revealed weaknesses in the B-17's defensive coverage, particularly in frontal attacks where the bomber's forward-firing armament was limited. Early B-17E models had only handheld .30 caliber machine guns firing through the nose windows, which proved inadequate against head-on zero attacks. Boeing responded by developing the B-17F model with improved nose armament, and eventually the B-17G with a chin turret mounting twin 50 caliber machine guns specifically designed to counter frontal attacks. Each iteration of the Flying Fortress incorporated lessons learned from combat, adding armor in vulnerable areas, improving gun positions, enhancing fire control systems, and increasing ammunition capacity. The B-17 was evolving, becoming more lethal and more survivable with each new variant. Crew training also improved dramatically as combat veterans rotated back to the United States and shared their hard-won knowledge with new crews. Gunners learned to coordinate their fire more effectively, creating interlocking fields that made it almost impossible for fighters to approach safely. Pilots learned formation flying techniques that maximized defensive coverage while maintaining bombing accuracy. Bombardiers developed tactics for hitting targets, despite fighter attacks and heavy flak. The institutional knowledge of how to fight and survive in a B-17 was growing exponentially, and this knowledge was being systematically incorporated into training programs. By mid-1943, a newly trained B-17 crew arriving in the Pacific had the benefit of 2 years of combat experience distilled into their training, making them far more effective than the pioneering crews of 1942. The Japanese response was hampered by cultural and institutional factors that made it difficult to adapt quickly. The Japanese military culture emphasized individual heroism and aggressive spirit over systematic tactical analysis. Pilots who suggested defensive or cautious tactics were sometimes viewed as lacking fighting spirit, even when their suggestions were tactically sound. Additionally, Japan's limited industrial capacity meant that new aircraft designs took longer to develop and produce. While American factories were churning out improved B-17 variants by the hundreds, Japanese aircraft production struggled to maintain existing numbers, let alone introduce new designs. The technological and industrial gap between the two nations was widening, and nowhere was this more evident than in the skies over the Pacific, where flying fortresses operated with increasing impunity. By late 1942, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. The B-17, once mocked as a flying dump truck, had become one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific theater. Japanese commanders who had dismissed American bombers as easy targets now issued urgent requests for more fighters, more anti-aircraft guns, more of everything needed to counter the flying fortress threat. But resources were limited and growing more scarce as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines. The Zero, which had dominated the skies in 1941, was now facing opponents it could not easily defeat. The lightweight, maneuverable fighter that had seemed so superior at the war's beginning was revealing its weaknesses: fragility, limited armament, lack of armor, weaknesses that the rugged, heavily armed B-17 exploited ruthlessly. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, recovering from wounds sustained in a later engagement, wrote in his diary, "We were told the Americans were soft, that their aircraft were inferior, that our spirit would overcome their material advantages. But the B-17 has taught us otherwise. It is not an inferior aircraft flown by soft men. It is a superior weapon system, flown by brave and skilled crews, supported by an industrial base we cannot match. We can shoot them down, yes, but at what cost? For every fortress we destroy, we lose pilots we cannot replace, while the Americans simply build more bombers and train more crews. This is not a war we can win through spirit alone." It was a sobering assessment from one of Japan's finest pilots, and it reflected a growing realization among Japanese commanders that the war was turning against them. The production line stretched as far as the eye could see, a river of aluminum and steel flowing through the massive factory. Every 63 minutes, a completed B-17 rolled out of the plant, engines tested, guns installed, ready for combat. It was an industrial miracle that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Boeing, along with Douglas and Lockheed Vega, was producing B-17s at a rate that exceeded the entire annual aircraft production of Japan. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed largely by women who had taken the places of men gone to war. Rosie the Riveter was not just propaganda. She was real, and she was building the weapons that would win the war. Each B-17 represented approximately 40,000 worker hours of labor, 13,000 separate parts, and a manufacturing cost of $238,000. But the investment was worth it. By the end of 1943, the B-17 had firmly established itself as one of the war's most effective weapons. In the Pacific, flying fortresses were striking targets throughout the Japanese-held territories, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies to the islands of the Central Pacific. The strategic bombing campaign was systematically destroying Japan's ability to wage war, hitting factories, refineries, shipyards, and transportation networks. Japanese air defenses, once formidable, were crumbling under the weight of sustained American air attacks. Fighter units that had been elite formations in 1941 were now shadows of their former strength, depleted by combat losses and unable to replace experienced pilots. The Zero, which had terrorized Allied pilots in the war's early months, was now outclassed by newer American fighters, like the P-38 Lightning and F-6F Hellcat. And even when Zeros did engage B-17 formations, they faced defensive firepower that made successful attacks prohibitively costly. The European theater told a similar story. B-17s of the 8th Air Force were conducting daylight precision bombing raids deep into Nazi Germany, hitting industrial targets that were critical to the German war effort. The losses were heavy, far heavier than in the Pacific. But the B-17 proved capable of absorbing punishment that would have annihilated any other bomber. Stories of B-17s returning to base with catastrophic damage became legendary. Aircraft with entire tail sections nearly severed, bombers with engines torn off, fortresses with gaping holes in the fuselage large enough to walk through. One B-17 named All-American returned to base with its entire rear fuselage, nearly cut in half after a mid-air collision, held together only by the keel beam and control cables. Another, Memphis Belle, completed 25 combat missions over Europe and became the subject of a documentary film that showcased the B-17's capabilities to the American public. The Japanese High Command's initial dismissal of the B-17 as a flying dump truck now seemed tragically short-sighted. What they had mocked as slow and ungainly was actually a carefully engineered weapons system optimized for its specific mission, delivering bombs to distant targets and returning its crew safely home. Speed and maneuverability, the qualities Japanese designers had prioritized in the Zero, were less important in a strategic bomber than survivability, payload capacity, range, and defensive armament, all areas where the B-17 excelled. The Flying Fortress represented a different philosophy of air warfare, one based on industrial strength, technological sophistication, and systematic operational planning, rather than individual pilot skill and aggressive spirit. Both approaches had their merits, but in a prolonged industrial war, the American approach proved superior. The tactical lessons learned from B-17 operations influenced aircraft design for decades after the war. The importance of redundant systems, crew armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and concentrated defensive firepower became standard features in military aircraft design. The B-17 demonstrated that survivability was not just about avoiding hits, but about absorbing damage and continuing to function, a principle that would be incorporated into everything from the B-52 Stratofortress to the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The Flying Fortress also validated the concept of daylight precision bombing, proving that properly equipped and trained bomber formations could strike strategic targets in defended airspace and achieve mission objectives despite heavy opposition. This doctrine would shape American air power strategy throughout the Cold War and beyond. For the Japanese pilots who fought against the B-17, the experience was transformative and often traumatic. Many of the cocky young aviators who had mocked the American bomber in 1941 were dead by 1943, shot down by B-17 gunners, or killed in the grinding attrition of the Pacific Air War. Those who survived had developed a grudging respect for the Flying Fortress and the men who flew it. They had learned that American crews were not soft or cowardly, that American aircraft were not inferior, and that American industrial power was not something that could be overcome through fighting spirit alone. Some Japanese pilots, like Saburo Sakai, would later write that their first encounters with B-17s were the moment they realized Japan might not win the war. The psychological impact of facing an opponent who seemed to absorb everything you threw at him and keep coming was profound and demoralizing. Captain James Dolan, who had led that raid on Rabaul in April 1942, completed 35 combat missions before rotating back to the United States in early 1944. He survived the war and later wrote a memoir about his experiences. In it, he described the B-17 as the aircraft that saved my life more times than I can count. He recounted missions where his fortress had been hit by hundreds of bullets and dozens of cannon shells, where engines had been shot out and control surfaces damaged, where crew members had been wounded and systems had failed, and yet the aircraft had always brought them home. The Japanese called it a dump truck, Dolan wrote, but to us it was a guardian angel made of aluminum and steel. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable aircraft in the sky, but it was the toughest. And in combat, toughness matters more than anything else. By war's end, Boeing and its partners had produced 12,731 B-17s in various models. These aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of combat missions, dropped more than 640,000 tons of bombs, and played a crucial role in defeating both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The cost was high. Approximately 4,750 B-17s were lost in combat, and thousands of crewmen were killed or captured, but the strategic impact was immeasurable. The Flying Fortress helped establish American air superiority, destroyed the enemy's industrial capacity, and demonstrated the decisive power of strategic bombing. More than that, it became a symbol of American technological prowess and industrial might, a tangible demonstration that the United States could outproduce, out-engineer, and ultimately outlast its enemies. The B-17's legacy extends beyond its combat record. It represented a moment when American industry, engineering, and military doctrine came together to create something truly revolutionary. The Flying Fortress was not just an aircraft. It was a system, a philosophy, a statement about how wars would be fought in the industrial age. The Japanese admirals who mocked it in 1941 had failed to understand this. They saw only a slow, ungainly bomber and dismissed it based on superficial characteristics. They did not see the redundant systems, the defensive firepower, the structural integrity, the strategic doctrine, and the industrial capacity that made the B-17 one of history's most effective weapons. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The Flying Fortresses were overhead, and they would keep coming until the war was won. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, carefully maintained by museums and historical organizations. They appear at air shows where crowds gather to see these legendary aircraft fly, to hear the distinctive sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, to marvel at the size and complexity of a bomber that once filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific. Veterans who flew in B-17s, now in their 90s or older, sometimes attend these shows. And when they do, they often stand quietly watching their old aircraft fly, remembering the missions they flew, the friends they lost, and the aircraft that brought them home. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name in the crucible of combat, and its legend endures as a testament to the courage of the men who flew it and the ingenuity of the nation that built it. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. Japan's cities were burning under relentless B-29 raids. Its navy was destroyed, its army isolated and starving on bypassed islands throughout the Pacific. But the B-17s were still flying, still striking targets, still bringing their crews home. Captain Dolan, now a major and squadron commander, stood on the tarmac, watching his aircraft prepare for what intelligence suggested might be one of the last missions of the war. The target was a Japanese airfield on a small island that had somehow escaped destruction, a final pocket of resistance that needed to be eliminated before the invasion of Japan itself. Dolan's crew had changed over the years. Some had completed their tours and gone home. Others had been killed or wounded and replaced, but the aircraft, his aircraft, was still flying. It had been repaired dozens of times, had returned from missions that should have destroyed it, had absorbed more punishment than any aircraft had a right to survive. The ground crew had nicknamed it Immortal because it seemed impossible to kill. Dolan ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the patches and repairs, the scars of 3 years of combat. This old bird had earned its rest. The mission went smoothly. The Japanese fighters that rose to meet them were few and poorly coordinated, flown by inexperienced pilots in worn-out aircraft. The days when Zeros swarmed B-17 formations in deadly numbers were long gone. American fighters, P-51 Mustangs now, escorting the bombers all the way to the target, made short work of the Japanese interceptors. The bombs fell accurately, the airfield was destroyed, and the formation turned for home, without losing a single aircraft. It was almost anticlimactic, nothing like the savage battles of 1942 and 1943. But that was the point. American air power had grown so overwhelming that Japanese resistance had become futile. As they approached Tinian, Dolan looked out at the formation around him, dozens of B-17s, all returning safely, all having completed their mission. He thought about the Japanese admirals who had mocked these aircraft 4 years earlier, who had called them dump trucks and predicted they would be easy prey. Those admirals had been wrong about everything. Wrong about American resolve, wrong about American industrial capacity, wrong about American fighting spirit, and most of all, wrong about the B-17. The Flying Fortress had proven itself in the most demanding test possible, combat, and had emerged as one of history's great aircraft. 2 weeks later, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The B-17s flew their last combat missions. Then began the long journey home. Dolan's aircraft, the Immortal, made one final flight back to the United States, where it would be decommissioned and eventually scrapped. Dolan stood beside it one last time before it was taken away, saying goodbye to the machine that had saved his life so many times. "You were never a dump truck," he said quietly. "You were a fortress, and you never let us down." Years later, When people asked Dolan about the war, he would always talk about the B-17, not about the missions or the medals or the victories, but about the aircraft itself, its strength, its reliability, its stubborn refusal to quit. The Japanese thought they could mock it and dismiss it, he would say, but the B-17 had the last word. It outlasted them, outfought them, and helped win the war. That's the only answer that matters.